Smiling faces.
And then,
And here we are. No, you can say anything you'd like because we're letting people in the room now. This is the joy of starting just a couple minutes after the gunfires in the race. Hello, folks. My name is Jay Frost, and if you're new to this menagerie, this is the Philanthropy Mastermind series, and it's great to have you back. If you've been here before, and if you haven't, it's great to see you for the first time. We actually cannot see you. That's the wrong word to use. We cannot hear you. So there are going to be two ways today that we'd like you to interact with us. And I'm going to suggest those to you now before I introduce the two very patient guests we have here. And those are to first take a look at the bottom of the screen where you can see already we're getting Guten Tag and other things being written in the chat, and that's perfect. That's exactly what we want you to do. Hello there, Patricia from Louisiana. Oh, it's good to see Kalamazoo. Thank you. We would love you to utilize chat to let us know that you're here, to talk amongst one another. Use it for however you wish, frankly. But the questions, we would love it if you'd put the questions in the Q&A so we don't miss any of those later after the conclusion of the presentation today. So once again, use chat as much as you want. That's a fun place to go, and it's great for you to let the presenters know that you're here. Use Q&A for the questions, please. Now, if you're not familiar with the series, you won't learn a lot about it or about DonorSearch today, because DonorSearch provides a platform where we can have guests like this for you. You're going to see that we've had over 500 of these programs going back to 2016, and many of the more recent ones are available for you over at donorsearch.net. So you can look for that there, and while you're there, you can check out what they have to offer to help you learn about your donors, because of course, if anything links us all together in this world, it's care for the people who support the work that we do and the missions that we carry out. The other thing you will do is you will be able to find a recording of this session there, so you can share it with your colleagues after today's presentation. That'll be there in just a couple of days, as well as on YouTube. So I hope you'll share it with your colleagues. Now, with that, I want to finally introduce Cherry and Koshi, Barbara O'Reilly. They're that way on my screen, but also that way alphabetically. And you may know their work already, but to make sure I do them a little bit of justice, I'll just give you the briefest of thumbnails. So first of all, with Cherian, Cherian is, of course, a CFRE. He's a chartered advisor in philanthropy and an AFP master trainer. He's a consultant and principal at Endowment Partners, which is a firm that you want to look up, as well as a consultant in the field. So you may be familiar with his work, and if you're not, I know he will share where you can find his coordinates afterwards. And Barbara, also a familiar face to all of us here in the field, who's been working in the sector for such a long time, working with so many really important organizations carrying out their missions around the world, is among many things also a CFRE, an AFP master trainer. They both share that. She's also been immediate past president of the AFP chapter here in the Washington, D.C. area, which is among the largest, if not the largest in the country, has been on the advisory panel for Rogare, and on and on and on. In addition to me, my neighbor. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way and let them present this really important topic today, and then I'll come back in towards the end to help facilitate questions. So with that, thank you both so much for being here today. Really appreciate you.
Thanks for having us, Mark. Thanks for having us, Jay.
Thank you. Thanks. We're delighted to be here. Okay, so let me get the tech in order. Thank you, everyone. We are delighted. Cherian and I are, in fact, sort of debuting, I guess, if you would, some new content. We had an opportunity to hear an author by the name of Tim Arnold, who wrote a book called Lead with And from that conversation, it sort of inspired us to think about how we can think about leading with and in fundraising. How does it apply to the sector and to our work as fundraisers? And so you've already seen and met us. So what we're going to talk about today are how we define that. We start with what's that either or mindset that we often find ourselves in, or we find ourselves working in. And how do we broaden that to a both and mindset, which can be sometimes a really difficult shift to make. We are going to share with you the 6 tensions, as Tim calls it, but really drill down on three that really resonated with us and what we see in the sector for sure. And throughout all of this, we're going to be really talking through what are those questions that you all need to be having and discussing internally to be able to balance these tensions, because the reality is that we don't live in an either or world. In our work as fundraisers and nonprofit leaders isn't an either or. So there is sometimes, though, a natural tension that will arise from two ends of the spectrum, if you would. And so how do you balance that in a way that can still propel your organization forward? So we found ourselves in 2020, 2021, sort of in that great pivot of constantly reevaluating, constantly reforecasting, constantly rethinking our plans, our strategies, our way forward, whether it was 2020, 2021, now 2022, and everything that this year has been bringing, including in high inflation and the absolutely definite forecast now of a recession, as Jamie Dimon has very clearly stated, will probably happen in March or so, February or March. And we've been talking about recession for like the last 2 years. And Cherian, you have written about the stagflation. So in your very brilliant financial mind. So there are lots of economic factors that are now weighing on how we think about and have conversations with our donors. So it can force us as leaders and as fundraising experts to say, all right, is it this way that we're going to be adapting our fundraising, or that? Is it, and becomes this one or the other? But as Cherian will describe, it is in fact both and.
So thanks, Barbara. I think one of the things that we are challenged with in the fundraising sector is sort of the choices that we're making, particularly right now, as Barbara so eloquently mentioned. We've been dealing with pandemic and economic issues. I'm federally regulated, so I'm not going to make any sort of predictions around recession or inflation or anything like that. Jamie Dimon can do whatever he chooses to do there. And so when Barbara and I were at this workshop with this author and I'll hold up the book and you'll see it later, but Lead with And. My copy is signed, yours isn't, so haha. But it's a lovely book, and it's really, we immediately sort of locked eyes across the room and said, this is really an opportunity, because we sit in a place when we're making decisions saying, how do we move forward on one of these pieces? And what resilience really requires is our ability to hold these concepts in tension. And what we want to talk with you about today is holding these different pieces in tension. And so one of the slides that we want to share with you is the 6 leadership tensions that we feel have a very specific role in nonprofits. One is the combination of being optimistic and realistic. So you probably throughout the last couple of years have seen the challenge with trying to maintain optimism, and some folks that are going way over on the side of optimism, and then other folks that are going on the far side of realism. So these are sort of these tensions that we need to hold together. Some of which we'll go into more detail, but we just encourage you to check out the book as well. So embracing change and preserving stability, being profit-focused and purpose-driven, having expectations and extending grace, caring for others and caring for yourself, and then building confidence and remaining humble. So Tim, in his book, goes through all of these challenges. We want to dive deeper into a few of these, and we're going to start with embracing change and preserving stability. And so with this particular one, the imagery that Tim talks about is sort of this infinity loop. And the exercise, what I love about the way in which Tim describes this is that you can hold these different tensions and use this as a way of thinking. But when it comes to embracing change, you can imagine that there is a way of going too far on one end of the spectrum or the other. So for example, I'll just cover 1 and 2, and then Barbara, you want to cover 3 and 4. So 1 is that bottom left quadrant called frozen and failing. So you don't embrace change at all, and you are maintaining stability at all costs. And so you aren't moving, you are just staying and doing, essentially nothing. And then 2 is where your hair's on fire and you are massively adopting change all the time, but it's entirely chaotic and nobody can keep up.
Yeah, and so 3 is high instability, very low in change. So this is what I like to call death by 6 words. We've always done it that way. It's sort of staying the course, continuing with your organizational plan, continuing with your fundraising plan, but not really building in any of that bandwidth or that flexibility to be able to test and innovate and adapt. But the ideal space is really this current and confidence. So you are always thinking about how can you reach that space by asking the right questions, by allowing yourself to preserve what is working and current and stable, but also allowing that space for change. So what's interesting is, as I was looking at this particular tension, I was reminded of some research that that my firm and DonorSearch and Bloomerang funded with Dr. Adrian Sargent 2 years ago about development planning. And one of the things that was really interesting was that it wasn't, the study looked at not just do organizations have development plans and do they raise more money if they have development plans, but what else does the development plan or the act of having a development plan affect and change? And so I was reminded, and thinking about this tension, I was reminded of that research because of the 72%, I think, who said that they have a development plan, about 50% said that they have an innovative culture and or mindset. So right there, I felt like the correlation was hard to miss. So one of the things that we want to ask ourselves when we try to evaluate these two tensions of change and stability are, how is your fundraising staying relevant and responsive to outside factors? So maybe it's adapting your fundraising tactics and activities in light of everything that these last couple of years have thrown at us. It might also be looking at very clearly what are the things that have worked for us. So it is not just we've always done it that way, but it's we've done it that way, it has worked well, and we're going to continue to do that. But we're also going to try other things that we haven't done yet, but we think might be worth experimenting and testing. So so really understanding those two factors and allowing yourself that space, allowing also to learn from what hasn't worked, and is it worth adapting and iterating, or is it just the right time to jettison that particular activity? We won't go into it, but something, for example, like galas. Right now, galas are back full swing, but there were moments where organizations were thinking, what do we do? How do we adapt this? Is this something we're going to continue forward? If this is our biggest Achilles heel, how do we make up for that, right? So this is a perfect example of that, embracing change and maintaining the stability, preserving the stability. I also take inspiration from Jim Collins's Good to Great book, where he talks about those core factors that were essential for all of the big companies that he evaluated that became those big national global brands. And one of the things that he talks about was understanding what those brutal facts are, whatever your reality is, right? And so that's part of the analysis that you do, hopefully on a regular basis, about what's working, what's not working, where do you need to course correct. But it's also looking at what are those external factors and how are they helping or hindering your fundraising. This middle, retaining the faith that you will prevail. That's the sort of the Admiral Stockdale quote, which is, I think, it gave me great hope in the early days of this pandemic, that we have to continue to keep moving forward and we will get through this. But also then, do you have the right team And do you have the right board in place, in the right seats, doing the right roles? So it is the assessment that you do in thinking about change and stability are not just your activities and your tactics, but it's all those other factors like people and volunteers and mindsets that go into whether or not those areas are successful. I also, want to pay tribute to the late Simone Joyaux, who challenged all of us to ask those cage rattling questions, the CRQs. And so especially when it comes to rethinking our fundraising strategies and whether or not your organization has a development plan, and I hope they do, the CRQs are important to be asking on a regular basis with your teams, with your boards, and with your executive leaders to understand where can we be improving. We always want to have that mindset of pushing the envelope a little bit, of testing and making sure that we are as equitable in all of our activities as we can, but we're also pushing ourselves for success. Sharon, do you want to walk us through a little bit of where the change and the stability can also be coming into play?
You bet. So surprise, surprise, it's November. And so it's 8 weeks until the end of the calendar year. And so talking about change during this period of time is really challenging. Here's the thing, however, it's never a good time to talk about change. Mm-hmm. And as a result, we can get trapped into this mindset of, well, it's too late, we can't do anything like that. And then something else comes up and we have this inertia that propels us through the end of year, through next spring, that makes it difficult for us to ever stop and say, what should we be doing differently? So one of the things that we want to encourage you to do is take a hard look at your results, whether it's the end of year results that you are having throughout the course of the next eight weeks, and where can you do things differently? Don't forget that there are clues and suggestions and ideas all around you. Picasso used to say that good artists copy and great artists steal. And so we truly believe that there's an opportunity to, my coach used to say, beg, borrow, and steal from other folks who are doing things well. And obviously we're not literally copying from other folks, but there's an opportunity to see where others have gone and take our own DNA and put that into place. But that we will also want to put innovation front and center in our budget to say, what are we going to try? What are we going to approach differently? And we'll talk more about that in a bit. If you are not testing, you can do some sort of testing around appeals and language and strategies even in the next 8 weeks. So we encourage you to do some sort of testing and measuring, and then start to build out a regular cycle of testing and iterating throughout the course of the next 2 months and then moving into next year. So keep that as sort of a forefront in your mind. And that sort of brings up the next dilemma that we face as nonprofit leaders, which is the distinction between being profit focused and purpose driven. And when we talk about nonprofits, obviously we're not profiting to one particular person or a group of people. So this can be, but it's important to recognize that nonprofit is a tax designation. It is not a business model. So there are elements of how do we raise money and how do we accomplish the goals that we have set in front of us. So again, on the left side of the nonprofit approach to profit-focused and purpose-driven is this idea of sort of being insignificant and insolvent, where we are not raising enough money and we're not doing anything meaningful because we don't raise enough money. And then on the top of that quadrant is the idea of making a lot of money, but not having a purpose around it. And that becomes life draining, as Tim would indicate.
Yeah, and then the lowest quadrant on the right, high purpose driven and low profit focus. And we should probably just put a context. The profit focused in the nonprofit sector is sort of that is thinking about how much money can we raise, right? And this is not profit focused in the business side as we define it, but it's It is, how can we raise more and more money? How can we make sure that our staff are fully compensated and appropriately, and so forth, all of those things. So in the quadrant 3, visionary and vulnerable, is where, you know, you're sort of only focused on your purpose, but yet you aren't investing enough in the areas that are going to help drive that profit, which is more revenue for your mission. The ideal place is making a difference and making a living. And what goes into that, to reaching that quadrant, is thinking about your purpose, thinking about your comparative edge as an institution, as an organization, understanding with greatest clarity, what do you need to move forward to get to that vision, to get to really fulfilling your purpose, and not being embarrassed about costs, not feeling like lean and mean is a badge of honor. So you're making a difference, and you're also getting the resources, the financial resources, staff resources that you need to make that difference. And it's you've got those infrastructure in place. You've got the strategic plan that's clear. You've got the full buy-in. You've got the clear cost, no matter how out of reach that may seem right now. But you understand exactly what you need to get to your vision.
So being mindful of time, and also knowing that there are other DonorSearch webinars where I've talked about some of these things before, I want to make sure that we talk about briefly how we involve innovation, testing, and understanding what we can do differently at a high level. So the first thing is, in order to have a breakthrough, we need to understand where we are as an organization. And when I started reading Les McEwen's book, Predictable Success, and training with him, one of the things that I saw in this model that he described is my life as a fundraiser put pro forma on this model. So I remember being in organizations that were experiencing early struggle and fun and whitewater, a little bit in predictable success, but certainly on the right side as well. If you don't know where you are as an organization, first and foremost, I'll share with you a way you can find out, but at the end of the session. But the other thing to remember is that what innovation looks like for you and what growth looks like for you depends upon where you are. So the same strategy put pro forma on an organization in a different portion of the life cycle won't really work for you. But once you kind of key into, okay, we're in early struggle, we don't have really a donor base, but we have an idea of what our nonprofit does, then we can start using a framework for thinking about how we might be able to do something different. And this is the 6-part framework. You would essentially pick which strategy you would use. So is there something that we want to accelerate upon because we see potential for it? Is there something that we want to reduce and kind of focus on because we're doing too much? Are there 2 things that we're doing that could work together to bring about a greater result? Is there something that we've done in the past that didn't make sense at the time, that was anachronistic then, but is something that now makes more sense? And is there something that hasn't been done before whatsoever, that if we pulled these ideas apart and separated them, we could have more success with one of the ideas separated? These are some really good questions to be asking as you start thinking about how do we do things differently, especially moving into 2023. And one of the big ideas that I want to encourage you to think about is how to not only, we talk about, the idea of failure, and I've talked about it on a DonorSearch webinar before, and I want to sort of level this up to those of you who have not heard it before, because it's important for us to recognize that sometimes we talk about how it's okay to fail, that we're comfortable with failure. And what I've evolved this thinking, even since the last DonorSearch webinar, to come to is the idea of actually producing a failure permission slip. And the concept here is that we would not only budget for failure, not only kind of, and as I mentioned before, I would work with my team around failure projects, that they were coached to build out projects that would be designed intentionally to potentially fail, but that we have this idea of a failure permission slip because it enables us to say we want to encourage this behavior. If we don't truly encourage it, we create the problem of some people saying, well, I know that it's okay, but I don't really want to do that. And one of the examples comes from the UK, where they actually funded failure, and the project that came out of that at the television production studio was a show called The Office. And so the key idea was they wanted to do something different. They had these funds set aside. And as you're thinking about your budgeting for next calendar year, what are some ideas that you could test, that you could fund in order to see if that advice would work? If there are two books that I could recommend to you, they're both by Annie Duke, who is a former poker player. She might still play poker, I don't know, but she has two books that I really love. One that's a bit older that I've talked about before called Thinking in Bets, and the other called Quit. And it really speaks into my behavioral science brain around the idea of some of these fallacies that we think about as nonprofit professionals. So one of the issues that comes up that we've talked about before is the idea that we've already done things this way. We're sort of, it's too late for us to make these changes. And what Annie talks about in Quit in particular is the idea of a sunk cost fallacy, where we put this effort towards it and we can't say no because we've contributed so much time and money towards that effort. And what I would encourage you to do, especially as you turn the corner into a new year, is to think about intentional destruction of the work that you've done. Plan to destroy the work that you've done. And the example is that when the United States and North America was being discovered, one of the ways in which explorers would encourage their people not to kind of go back to the old world, to hop on the ships again, is that they would destroy the ships in the harbor. So there was really no looking back. And one of the things that I've done with teams that I've worked on is to say, we're going to focus on zero-based strategy, meaning nothing comes back into 2023 that we can't intentionally justify with best practice and data and good research that tells us this is the right way to do things. Now, does it mean getting rid of quite literally everything? For me, for my teams, it has meant that. It may not mean that precisely for you, but my old coach used to say, what got you here won't get you there. So you've got to really think, and if Barbara and Jamie Dimon are correct that there's a recession in 2023, because they're basically the same brain, if they're correct, then this recession will look quite a bit different from previous recessions. What that means, I'm not going to talk about, but that recession will require you to think differently about fundraising. So really rethinking your strategy is really important, and being oriented around specific sort of kind of unlikely goals is helpful in rethinking how you frame your strategic approach. So the example, Barbara and I have a friend, a professor, Rob Sheehan, who wrote a book called Mission Impact. And one of the examples that he gives in his book is the idea that when the United States was building trains, they were doing so at the same time as the Japanese. And the United States really just thought about, quite literally, getting from place to place. So they built trains that took them a long time. And we have trains that, has anybody ridden a train lately? Not a ton, right? And certainly not, it's not the most efficient system. But in Japan, they set the goal of crossing the island at a very fast pace. And it wasn't something that was really achieved at the time, but because the goal was different, they looked at thinking about building the train differently. And the trains are quite a bit faster, and quite a lot of people in Japan use trains to get around the island because of how they structured that. So finally, we want you to think about asking some significant questions around what your organization will look like in 2023. So first of all, are you pursuing scalability, or are you just sort of just fixing some language? Are you just fixing an idea? Are you offering a minor repair to a larger problem that exists in your organization? Are you taking calculated and diversified risks in your organization? And then also, enough in your organization to maximize your effect. So one of the things that we encourage you to take back from this presentation to board leadership and executive leadership is the idea that if there is a recession coming, now is the time to be strategically investing in fundraising systems, to be able to do good stewardship, to engage donors meaningfully, so that when a potential recession is over, you are a stronger, more resilient organization coming out of the recession when the economy and the markets are doing better, and to think of this as truly an opportunity to invest wisely in staffing and tools and resources that would help your organization to grow.
Yeah, and I would add to those questions that, whether you are trying to balance the tensions between change and stability, or this one, which is profit-driven or mission-focused, it all comes down to, are you being clear and honest about, clear and honest about what it is you really need to be able to scale? So to Cherian's point, now is the time to start thinking about what does that ideal state of your fundraising and your nonprofit leadership look like? And you suspend the moment that you're in now of what you might have in terms of financial resources and what you might not. That's often where organizations get stuck, is thinking, well, we don't have that budget to be able to hire more staff, to be able to invest in all the tech tools that we need, to be able to have working computers and all the other things, right? But we have to suspend that to say, how can we be fully purpose-driven and profit-focused, which means that we've got the resources we need to be able to do and scale. So the third tension that we're going to talk about is this having expectations versus extending grace. And this is a tough one, and I personally struggle with this one because we all have, or at least I have, very high expectations for myself and others. But as we've seen over the last 2 years, there has been more and more that comes out in the Chronicle, in all of our nonprofit publications, and in all the business publications, tons of podcasts about how do we extend grace, how do we lead differently because of all the extenuating circumstances that we are all finding ourselves in. And so where this comes into play is where we have very low expectations and we have very low grace that we're extending to the teams, and especially now in a new hybrid or fully remote work environments that our organizations are in. Are we just getting by? Are we just expecting the bare minimum from our teams? Or are we in quadrant 2 so driven, so setting such high expectations, but we aren't giving the teams what they need to be successful? We aren't maybe clearly identifying what those expectations are so that they can step forward. And so there's there's the high expectations and low grace, and then there's the low expectations and low grace, and neither one of them is ideal. It's not going to be the conditions that are going to really create the healthiest culture in your organization. And Jerry, do you want to talk about the high grace and high expectations?
Yeah, absolutely. So the opportunity then, I want to be mindful of our time as well, and the opportunity here for us, and this is an area for me to grow in as well, is thinking about how can we get to supportive and striving, where we are reaching for high expectations. We want to achieve well, but we're also recognizing that circumstances do occur. And so there's a lot to unpack here when it comes to leadership that I'm still working through in chapter 6, I think, of this book, and what that means to lead teams in a way that is supportive and striving, that we have a lot of opportunity for.
And I think one thing that's that research has shown us is that when we set that we all perform even better and more effectively when we have clear expectations, when we know what our job is, what the goals are, what you want us as employees to be working towards. And so in this balance of trying to find the right degree of grace and setting those expectations, we don't want to sacrifice the one for the other. So questions to be thinking about are, how do you gain or maintain the momentum of your culture, your workplace culture, whether it's in-person, hybrid, or completely remote, so that you can clearly articulate the expectations. You can have the right degree of grace that's in place. I would also add that this applies to your sort of up, down, sideways, and your board. So it isn't just the teams that you manage or to whom you're reporting, but how are you setting expectations for your board? And is it so high for them that they don't have the tools, resources, confidence, support that they need to be successful? Right? I mean, we
didn't talk about that before, but I think it's a great point to think about, like, what are expectations and how do we balance expectations and grace with board members as well?
Yeah, 100%. And by modeling that, hopefully it sort of comes back as well to the teams. But I think also this, to me, relates back to the previous tension where we talked about testing and iterating, and to both of the previous tensions where we talked about testing and iterating. Is the culture one in which it is acceptable to and expected to fail, that we don't always have to be hitting the ball out of the park, so to speak, that there is that grace to fail and it's okay because we're going to learn from it. And I would say also, are we giving our teams enough space so that they aren't burning out? That's one of the things that I definitely have been feeling has become so much more palpable in our sector, and the mental health, the mental health of our workforce and of our teams and of our leaders is being stretched in so many ways. And so extending grace does not necessarily mean that we aren't that we're showing any quote unquote signs of weakness or becoming lax as leaders and organizations. We are entrusting our teams with what they need to be able to perform well, so that they stick around and they don't leave during the quiet quitting or the great resignation or the not so quiet quitting, whatever it might be called now.
So it can be hard. We both acknowledge that the last several years has been really hard for all of us as fundraisers and working in nonprofits. It can be overwhelming. It can be frustrating, and particularly around end of year, things can seem frantic. We want to encourage you first and foremost to say there's a lot that we've shared with you, and we'll open this up to discussion, but we want to first and foremost thank you for the work that you're doing. And we definitely do not want to present this material to you in a way that says you're not doing enough and you need to do more and test and figure out a way to get better and all of that, without putting into context that your continued growth, you being on webinars like this and pushing yourself and encouraging yourself also has its own balance. And we want you to be thoughtful and mindful of your own self-care, and encourage you to live within this balance of success and failure, of innovation and stability, and all of these things. And Seth says this very well, that we need to sort of think about success as constantly moving from different forms of failure, and coming up with something that works. And we hope that this discussion, the discussion that we'll have after this portion, will help you kind of navigate that space and do what you can when you can to be thinking about these pieces, especially as you translate this into the next year and your development planning. So that is really the the key components that we want to leave you with. Certainly, thank you for being here. Thank you for participating in the discussion. You can reach out to us, all of our contact info, and we'd love to share more with you.
Thank you both very much for this. I have so many questions myself. I'm sure we will have questions from the audience, but I'm wondering if we want to keep your contact information up there for a moment. I believe that we all have the ability within our own desktops to shrink that slide a little bit if we want to see people's faces. So you can do that by just using that slider in the center of the screen, and then that way you have access to people's contact information for just a couple minutes. I'd love for people to be able to follow you both and where you're communicating about some of these issues and many other things. Once again, we do have the Q&A down at the bottom. I hope you'll use that to ask any questions. There was a tremendous amount of content and really top level thought here. And it was not what I was expecting at all, which I love, because it means that, I was learning and just taking notes. So if you don't mind, I'll take the liberty of asking something, and then we can go whatever direction you'd like to go. And once again, if you have a question or even just an observation of any type, use the Q&A to note that. This is a good chance for us to talk about some difficult and thorny issues. And so one of the first things that occurred to me, and these are really basic questions, is whether or not fundraising and program are always in the same life cycle. And the reason I ask that is because, when you're trying to figure out if we're really doing well against any of these tensions, one of the things is that from one perspective in the office, we might be in the lower quadrant of something, but then viewed from another perspective, let's say program. We've often seen that tension in program, between program and fundraising, for example, or even marketing and fundraising, or field staff if you're in a global organization, and domestic staff. All these kind of things exist, but also there's a different perception, right? Both about the work that we're doing and the work that someone else is doing. So do the fundraising and program always have to be in the same life cycle to do any of this analysis effectively?
I don't think so.
I don't see why it would. I think the key is understanding that there are potentially other life cycles, or you might be in different places in the quadrant for each different thing. Like, for example, with expectation and grace, you might be in quadrant 2, but on change and stability, you might be in quadrant 4. So it's about picking a spot and working on where that is at the particular time. So I think part of what we wanted to express in highlighting 3 of these is that right now may not be the ideal time to focus on fundraising, like massive fundraising change. Maybe there's a preserve stability for a couple of months here, and do what we can, but then think about maybe there is something, like to your point, about programming that could be addressed that's not as time sensitive, or around leadership that could be addressed. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Barbara, please.
Yeah, the other thing I would add to what Cherian just described is looking at any of these tensions with the widest lens as possible. So to the example you shared with programs and fundraising, what is it that you as an organization need to accomplish, and over what time frame? And then where are you in any of these tensions as an organization at large? And so if you are finding yourself in the lower left quadrant of that change and stability, whereas in other words, you're staying status quo and failing, that means that you're, as an organization, not meeting the goals and that they're going to move you forward as you've outlined, and hopefully you have a strategic plan. And so then you have to look at that more critically to say what components of our organization is not stepping up to make that change, to be able to hit those goals. Where are we hitting those the obstacles or the friction internally? And it could be not investing enough. It will, if it's there, they might say we don't have enough money, we're not raising enough. Well, okay, well then let's dig into that. Or it might be we don't have enough program staff, or we don't have something else, or there's internal competing demands, right? For limited resources and so forth. And so I think, collectively, all of those departments need to be facing the same way to move the organization towards the goals and the vision and the purpose that they are set out to achieve. And if you're not moving forward as an organization, pull apart and say what's preventing us from doing that, and where are we imbalanced in any of these tensions, and then address it and fix it that way.
Right. There's a lot to unpack in there, and maybe part of it goes to Nyla's question, where Nyla said, being from a smaller organization, please provide an example of a failure that might be common when trying changes in fundraising. And maybe you can even talk about those internal definitions of what constitutes failure. Who's the best judge of that, whether or not it's failure, since people aren't always lined up and facing the same direction as you just put it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll share one, and then Sherry, and I'm sure you have some others as well. I mean, I'd say one common failure I see organizations either do or are afraid to do is with regard to direct mail. There's that fear of that's costly, it's going to take time. We don't often snail mail. And so we don't want to invest, we don't want to purchase or rent a list or all those acquisition tactics. And so organizations are going to stick with what they have been doing, which is predominantly electronic communications. Right? It's cheap. We can do it as much as we want, right? Doesn't make a difference. Is it most strategic? Probably not. And so I've seen organizations where they do strategically segment, or they do something that might be different and mail to a different group, and then they don't raise money, and they say, well, see, we tried it and didn't work. Okay, we're never going to direct mail, doing snail mail again. So that's just a basic one that I see so often, and I'm constantly on my soapbox saying you've got to do multi-channel, you've got to do print and analog and digital. You can't avoid doing any print pieces, because we know that actually draws people in a little bit better than digital. Sharon, what else would you add?
So as an example, I mean, I love that example. I would even go a step further and saying, when we don't recognize donors for who they are and their engagement with our organization, that is a common failure that I see with nonprofits that I work with. And related to that is, so what I mean by that is, have they given to your organization before? Have they given to your organization recently? Have they given to your organization through direct mail or social media? Have they been a board member or a volunteer? How are we talking to them, and are we understanding kind of where they are and meeting them where they are and talking to them as real people? Or are we just sort of putting stuff out there and hoping that people will respond? And Jay, if it's okay, I'd love to combine this with the next question.
Please.
In there. So the next question, if you all can see this, is really the right question to be asking. Failure is scary for a lot of people, especially for leadership and the board. How do we get everyone to understand why to invest in failure in order to innovate? And I think the key is to understand that we're not doing their jobs as perfectly as well as we could be. And what we need to be clear about is the plethora of evidence that convinces us that we're not doing an awesome job when it comes to engaging donors. And no one is, period, end of story. So I don't mean that to make you feel discouraged, but and some people are doing this better than others, but they're doing so at potentially like some imbalance, like personal cost and time and whatnot. So when it comes to getting everyone to understand how to invest in failure, I think it's really about establishing what are the consequences of continuing as is. And for almost every organization, the consequence of continuing to do what you've done is losing money, losing relationships, losing awareness, and eventually not getting to do the great work that you're doing today. So, or even at the level that you're doing it today. So if I keep coming back to what my coach said, if you feel good about where you are today, awesome, great job. But what you need to do tomorrow, next year, 2 years from now, has to evolve. It has to be different in order to keep doing what you're doing today, or do even a little bit better. So I frame that, Tamsin Webster, Find the Red Thread, talks about change management by saying, what's the thing that we can all agree upon? And I think the thing that we can start with, we can all agree upon, is that change is the only constant. And that if we want to keep doing the good work that we're doing, we have to keep learning. We have to keep getting better at what we're doing. And I feel like everybody can agree with that.
Mhm.
You know, as we go through this, I'd be very interested to see how people in the room feel about that.
Yeah.
Because I have a feeling there are three people here who are very, well, I don't know if comfortable is the right word, that we find change compelling.
Mhm.
And so we're drawn to that. But is that true for your organization? So whether you want to use the chat or the Q&A to just comment on that, whether you think that your environment is ripe for change and whether or not they would recognize that change is the only constant, would be very interesting for us to hear. So if you feel free to comment on that if you wish. I'm sorry we don't have a poll up for that, but we really do want to hear from you. This gets to the heart of this issue about what constitutes failure. And I know that measurement is going to be different from organization to organization. But again, within the organization, it may be different. So I'm curious about how you negotiate that conversation, especially, Barbara, you made this reference to, I'm trying to remember how you did it because it was almost like geometry from, front to back and up and down and sideways and with the board, I think you said.
Yeah.
And it's very different for each of those people's perspectives, maybe on account of their age, their experience, their own, personal relationship, even to money. So if they look at the totality of it and they see something like we see the trajectory, we see a declining number of donors, then that should be kind of obvious, right? But then that's also been true for the entire sector. We've been watching it for over 20 years.
Yep.
The percentage of people in the United States who are giving, even if the raw number has increased because the population's increased, the percentage has dropped from around 70% to just under 50% in less than 2 decades. But still, people keep doing the same thing. So I don't know why that's true. If we understand that change is the only constant, but then we're seeing that the change is the one that we are allowing to happen through inertia. It's one that hurts us. Why is it that we're having so much difficulty getting people to invest in these small failures that lead us to success? Is it because the people at the very top are the most resistant to change, or is it something else?
I would say we're all wired to resist change. Personally and professionally, we are all wired to resist change. We are designed to be creatures of habit. Think about your last Starbucks order. It was probably the same or similar to one you did before. Right. And it's because of the cognitive load of making a different choice. Okay. So we are oriented around because it's too much, right? There are too many things that are happening. So the more we go through our personal and professional lives with an explosion of choices, it's harder and harder for us to make sense of that. And then when you get a group of people together who all think about, well, we don't have enough money and we're risking, we can't risk any of this money because what would happen if we lost it? It's a lot of times that's framed around like the idea of just throwing out a bet randomly. And what Annie Duke talks about in her book in particular is both sides of that. One is you need to have some research and understanding around what bets you make. So you're not just throwing money on the table to see what happens willy-nilly. You're doing so for a particular purpose to kind of see what will happen. But then her point around quitting, I think, is the argument for organizations who are doing things just because they've always done them, as Barbara mentioned, right? Are we doing the gala, the golf tournament, the auction, the whatever, because someone 30 years ago said it was a good idea and we're not making any money and it's a ton of time? Can we bring some evidence to this behavior and say, and that's why it's all about making the small change, because it's not about getting rid of the gala. That's potentially a bridge too far. It may be can we spend less time or less energy on the gala because we know that it's not revenue producing or not revenue producing around the way that we should do it.
And I would also add a different example that in fundraising, we view failure as not hitting our revenue goals, not hitting our fundraising goals. But I would encourage us to be pushing back on that, because we could hit our revenue goals year over year and maybe increase year over year. But when we peek under the hood, and I can't be on a webinar without getting in donor retention somewhere, right? And it could be that it's just total churn that is causing that revenue to perhaps stay steady or increase, but you're not keeping those donors. And so, Jay, to your bigger point about the national trends we're seeing about the declining number of donors, are we as fundraising leaders, as nonprofit leaders, placing enough emphasis on on avoiding what I would consider a fundraising failure, which is not understanding your numbers, not understanding your metrics? What are your donor retention rates? What are your average gifts? Are you really sustaining those relationships over time? And I had a client a number of years ago that we spent a lot of time getting a handle on those numbers. At their board meeting, towards the end of one of their board meetings, they were doing a year-over-year comparison, and they said, they were a little bit worried because they weren't where they were the previous year. I don't remember what was going on economically, but there were other factors that were going into it. And the fundraiser on the staff said, okay, well, yeah, we may be a little bit off where we were, but let's dig into some of where we've seen improvements. And she was able to articulate their retention. She was able to articulate the increased average gift size, which had been growing over the year. She had been able to talk about the number of new donors they were bringing on and the stewardship pieces they were putting in place to try to retain those donors. And so all of these other factors show that their fundraising was actually moving in the right direction. Maybe not in that moment, but over the longer term, they had a good handle on trends that we know, factors that we know that can sustain and grow a donor base over time. So I think that failure with regard to fundraising can't be measured in just amounts that we raise or don't raise. It has to be how healthy of a culture, of a mindset, of a staff, of activities, of a board involvement and leadership involvement do we have to create the right environment to be able to fundraise well.
I can't believe we're at 4:30 because I really do literally have 8 questions of my own, and I know that people are making comments about some of the things you've been saying here in the chat. It's also helpful. I want to just give a quick reminder, since some people will now leave and you won't stick around forever, that a recording of this will be placed over at the DonorSearch site under the resources tab. So you can look for, of course, other sessions there, but I hope you'll return to this one and share this with colleagues, because these issues are something that you can't cover in an hour. That if we're going to invest heavily in not just the theory of change, but the action of change, of making sure that what we're doing is measurable and attainable, not according to last year's standards, but the ones that are relevant to what happens next year, Jamie Dimon notwithstanding, then we better have a conversation about it. And it can't just be among a small group of us in the office. It sounds like, am I correct that this is going to have to be doing some kind of inventory of various stakeholders to determine what are the appropriate measures, and then being able to measure them in a kind of a dispassionate manner?
For sure, 100%. And I mean, we would recommend getting a copy of Tim's book, and there's a workbook that can also accompany it that can be used as a great tool with internal teams and stakeholders and boards, just to really go through which are the tensions that they feel are the most relevant for them and their organization now, and how do you work through it to find that right balance. If you're skewed in one way or the other, if you're too high expectations and not enough grace, for example, what are those questions that you can discuss internally to find the right balance? And the same with the 5 other tensions as well.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is a lot of organizations start the strategic planning process in January. And so this is a valuable resource. These books and the webinar and whatnot are all valuable resources as you go into that. But the thing that I would come back to in Annie Duke's book is any sort of strategy has to say no. It has to define what you will not do, what you
Yep.
won't do, and a lot of organizations fail to think about that when they go through strategic planning. So that's one kind of immediate relevant takeaway. I just highly recommend that you think about, what are you going to stop doing? Don't add more to your plate. What is it that you're going to stop doing?
Yeah. I do have to ask you about where we are collectively, because I don't know about where it is for where each of you are. Actually, I do know a little bit about what it's like for you, Barbara. But when you go to the grocery store or you go somewhere else, and whether or not people are wearing masks, whether or not people are getting booster shots, we know the statistics there. We all have traveled a little bit. We know what it's like in other states, other countries. The environment for not only making changes, whether it's thinking about the gala or how much direct mail or direct email we're going to do, or what we're going to do next year, are all being influenced by our perception about the safety of the environment, right? And how other people are feeling, and whether or not they want to give, and all these other things. How much is the change that's happening around us? How much do we have to build in our understanding or our ability to predict the future into some of the planning that we do? Because it's pretty hard for any of us to predict. That's how we began, as talking about Jamie Dimon. But the reality is that we're probably going to have to do a little bit of prognosticating in order to say, you know what, I think we can raise so much next year. But maybe the more important question is how we're going to do what we do, so we're more inclusive and we bring in new donors and supporters, and our work is more successful by not being afraid to fail at certain things in order to make it so. How much do we have to be able to predict a little bit of the future collectively in order to make those plans?
I would say it's not necessarily a matter of being able to predict the future, but it's about being able to read the room, proverbially read the room. So, for example, doing your good old SWOT analysis, your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and also something that Cherian and I have done for the Regari report that we did, which was a PESL, which looked at political and economic and societal and technological and legal and something else. I forget what the other E was. But it's basically, it's sort of like a SWOT, but on a meta level, looking at all of those external factors that may or may not be applicable to or influence or help or hinder your organization. So it's a matter of understanding the core concepts around changing and staying the same and moving forward strategically. But what are those guideposts, or what are those factors that might derail you, propel you, hold you back a little bit? Whatever analogy you want to use, whether it's, headwind, tailwind, adjusting your sails, whatever it might be. What are those factors that will either help you or not? And that you can understand, you can read the leaves now and know what's there, what's in the environment for us. And then understand what the right possible scenario might be. And I think this comes back to probably what a lot of organizations were doing in 2020, which was a lot of scenario planning, right? And so maybe it's not to that same degree now, but it's understanding variance, right? Minute variance of, okay, if this happens, then we have to do that. Or if we can't boost our donor retention numbers, where else can we, increase and support, build in that support for that gap? I don't know, Cherian, what would you add?
I don't know that I would add much at all there. I think the key is the only thing that I would caution people against is sort of long-term or even medium-term futurism. It's really hard to make predictions far out. So would it surprise me if Jamie Dimon's incorrect? Absolutely not. I think he fully anticipates being incorrect in some way as well. So I like to think about it as, Jay, from your example, thinking about it as sort of like looking through a cone. And there are certain things that are really close to us where we can predict, I can predict what will happen this afternoon with a little bit more certainty than next week, than next month, then next year. So, the further we get out, our predictive powers get less. And so I would just be mindful that, just like we've talked about with change, that approach needs constant revision with new context and new evidence. So will we have new variants this winter? Yeah, I highly anticipate that will occur. How significantly will that affect our economy and our workplaces? I don't know. Let's talk again in November, like at the end of November or December, and we'll have more information.
Okay. So I guess be ready for the different scenarios, as you're saying, and then be able to adjust, and once again build some analysis of not just risk, but some plans that are to exercise our tolerance for failure in the middle of that. And would you mind if I ask you one last question before we go?
Of course.
And you talked at the end about something which has been so important over the last 2 years, and it's not going to fade at all, but we may not give voice to it all the time. And that's this concept of grace. Would you mind defining it as you see it, and then just suggesting maybe as a final thought about how we can make sure that we are recognizing it together and that we're building into measurement for that in the future, so we don't just, as the numbers rise and fall and disasters come and go, we don't forget about this thing. We don't forget what it means, and we don't forget how to practice it.
So you're looking up the book. And so I define it, and Jerry will tell me if Tim has a different definition, of giving your teams, giving yourself the space to perform and move towards towards those expectations that you've set for yourself, but not for the sake of your mental health, your well-being, your confidence. So, and I'm sure Tim says it a bit much more eloquently than that, but for me, I've seen this particularly in our sector when there was everything moved to complete remote, right? Complete virtual. There were leaders who struggled with understanding, how do I maintain expectations, and how do I know that my teams are going to still do the work while I can't see them, while they are no longer in the office all the time. So what we had to learn over the last 2 years was that we had to trust that our teams, ourselves, we were going to get the work done, despite now suddenly all of these other extenuating factors that we were juggling while we're sitting in front of our desks and trying to manage our families and our personal lives and our kids and our work and all that. And we were going to get things done, but it may not get done in the same timeline that we might have originally agreed to, or it may not be done perfectly that those of us who are recovering perfectionists might have expected that we would get it done. So to me, it's trusting that the work will get done, trusting that the quality will still be there, and we will meet those expectations, but in a different timeline, or maybe not being worked to the bone, so to speak, to reach those goals. I don't know, Sharon, what does Tim say in the book?
Yeah, so this is not my own at all. So he defines grace as understanding and empathy, extending forgiveness, and unconditional acceptance. So you can imagine then, like, if it went too far, it would be problematic. But then he talks about positive results of grace, that unique circumstances are considered, that it provides the freedom to take risks and try new things, and that it creates a trusting and empathetic culture. And one of the things that I would share, Jay, is that as we talk about leadership a lot in the sector and creating spaces for leadership and growing in leadership, one of the most important things on a team is psychological safety.
Yeah.
So there's a core understanding of grace from my perspective, of creating that psychological safety amongst your team, that allows you to have these conversations and explore these ideas and take those kind of personal risks, if that makes sense.
I think also just what you just said, Sharon, reminded me that it's going back to that fear of failure, that the teams that we give ourselves that grace to not get it right the first time or the second time, that the failure is okay, that it doesn't mean that we're any less accomplished or successful as fundraisers, as leaders. But we are in this together, and we're figuring it out, and it may not go right the first time or second time or third time, but we're going to give ourselves the grace to fail and learn and adapt and adjust, while still maintaining those standards of our work and the quality and the expectations of what it is that we need to do to be high performing professionals. So I think that to me is also another definition of grace, is that is what you just said, Cherian, about that psychological safety, accepting that we don't have to have our game face on all the time, but we are in this together.
And that must be kind of a self-reinforcing loop too, because if we're trusting the people with us, then they're going to trust us as well. And that brings us to that top quadrant. There were a lot of graphics you had in here, and that last one might be lost a little bit in it because there was so much content, but that's supportive and striving. And I don't know how you do that unless you feel like you can trust one another. Exactly. There's been a lot here to unpack. I'm grateful to you both for opening my eyes a bit, and I'm sure for everybody else is here. And I saw a little note from Beth about her response to this, and Beth, I share that sentiment. Obviously, again, this is something you don't just do one bite of. So go and take another bite on YouTube, share it with your colleagues, and have that important conversation before we get into the new year with all of its various ripples. And hopefully we can have you both back to let us know if we're on course as we navigate the new realities of 2023. My thanks to you both, Cherian, Barbara. It's been great having you. Thanks to everybody who's hanging out with us today. We really appreciate you. We have another session coming up on Thursday. I'm not going to highlight it now, and we're a little late, but I hope you'll join us for that. Another great session. We've in fact got about 24 sessions this quarter. So I hope you'll be a part of a lot of that. And most importantly, if we are not responding to what you need to see and hear, please reach out and let me know. Let us know what you want to see and hear in the year ahead. And you can reach me at j@donorsearch.net. So until next time, take care. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.